You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Putinism is a term used to describe the unique blend of social, political, and economic structures that have come into place in Russia under the governance of Vladimir Putin. This model is distinguished by the control of power being vested in the hands of individuals with a background in the security or military services, which includes personnel from 22 different government enforcement agencies such as the Federal Security Service, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Armed Forces and the National Guard. Arnold Beichmann has pointedly stated that Putinism in the 21st century has become as significant a watchword as Stalinism was in the 20th. This reflects the notion that Putinism represents a significant and defining political ideology of its time. There is a perception that a small circle of Putin's allies, often referred to as a group of oligarchs, has seized control over significant parts of the Russian economy, the media, and the country's administrative mechanisms, while simultaneously limiting democratic processes and human rights. Julie Anderson has gone as far as to suggest that Russia has become an FSB state, alluding to the dominance of the Federal Security Service in the country's governance. One of the key aspects of the society shaped by Putinism is described as mass depoliticization, where public engagement in politics is discouraged and management of state affairs is left exclusively to those in power. In return for public disengagement from political life, the informal social contract of Putinism promises economic stability and a measure of freedom in individuals' private lives. The concept of Putinism was initially articulated by Andrei Piontkovsky, who laid out his interpretation in an article published in Sovetskaya Rossiya on January 11, 2000, which was simultaneously posted on the Yabloko political party's website. Piontkovsky depicted Putinism as the final phase of what he called bandit capitalism in Russia, a stage characterized by the abandonment of democratic freedoms and human rights, ethnic hatred-fueled national consolidation, attacks on free speech and media control, and a drift towards further economic decline and international isolation. Experts from varied disciplines such as sociology, economics, and political science tend to analyze distinct aspects of the same system. Publicists and journalists have identified several traits of Putinism, which include an undemocratic concentration of power in the hands of Vladimir Putin, often celebrated as a national hero in the media, marking a hardening of presidential authority beyond even that of Boris Yeltsin's era. There is an extensive state dominion over property and an attitude of sovereign democracy, which involves a symbiotic relationship with oligarchs who pledge absolute loyalty. Putinism encompasses a form of cronyism, exemplified by the Ozero Cooperative, and a political reliance on the Siloviki, officials from security agencies, many of whom are former associates of Putin. The judicial system operates with a biased application of laws, constituting a framework where friends are favored and enemies are penalized, marked by the phrase, "Everything is for the friends, the law is for the enemies." Despite maintaining seemingly liberal financial and tax systems, these systems lack transparency. The governance is noted for its manual control, wherein real power is held by the presidential administration rather than by a relatively powerless official government. The regime is characterized by extreme secrecy and backstage decision-making. There is a strong sentiment against perceived Western moral decay, including issues such as irreligion and same-sex marriages, with Putinism favoring Orthodox Christianity over liberal values and supporting other anti-liberal, right-wing authoritarians globally. The Russian political narrative includes the concept of defending the Great Russia as a facade for kleptocratic activities, with the state exhibiting hostility towards free expression and enforcing censorship. The authorities maintain a strategic association with the Russian Orthodox Church, which includes protecting the Church's property interests and fostering societal clericalization. Putinism promotes Eurasianism, the idea that Russia is a distinct civilization apart from European or Asian identities. Domestically, it also adheres to an extreme variant of Russian ultranationalism. On the international stage, Putinism looks back longingly at the Soviet era aspiring to the global influence the Soviet Union once wielded against the United States. Energy resources are employed as tools in international relations, often termed pipeline diplomacy. In light of conflicts like the Russo-Ukrainian crisis, Western leaders have described Putinism with a triad of authoritarianism, imperialism, and ethno-nationalism. Political scientists, such as M. Urnov and V. Casamara, among others, identify a substantial movement away from competitive policy foundations in Russia. Their observations cite centralization, an overbearing presidential authority, a dilution of regional and big business political influence, and both direct and indirect state control over major television channels. They note increased manipulations in regional and federal elections, the destruction of checks and balances in governance, a non-transparent political style, complete political control by the president, a preference for state interests over individual rights, with the repression of civil society, and fostering a besieged fortress mentality where opposition equates to betrayal. There's also the cult of personality associated with Putin, symbolizing the nation's continuity, post the disintegration of the USSR. Putinism is characterized by bureaucratic authoritarianism, the ruling party's integration with bureaucratic machinery, state corporatism, and a stringent state hold over property. It is inclined toward an aggressive international stance and jingoistic policies, while emphasizing order and conservative norms inwardly, promoting nationalistic ideology, and fostering anti-Western sentiments. Russian political analyst Andrei Pionkovsky draws parallels between Putinism and historic German fascism, including resemblances between Putin's rhetoric and that of Adolf Hitler. In a 2004 study, sociologist Olga Krishtanovskaya revealed that Siloviks, or individuals with backgrounds in military or security service, accounted for 1/4 of Russia's political elite. Closer to President Putin, the percentage of Siloviks increased dramatically. They constituted 58% of his immediate circle of approximately 20 advisors. However, their presence in wider political institutions was less pronounced, with 18 to 20% in the parliament and 34% in the government. Krishtanovskaya explained that the rise of the Siloviks was not the result of a power grab by the Kremlin bureaucracy, but rather a strategic move to restore order at the beckoning of the political establishment. This shift began to take place during Boris Yeltsin's second presidential term in 1996, as the political elite sought to stabilize the country after a period of upheaval. The trend accelerated when Vladimir Putin, himself a Silovik, became Prime Minister in 1999. Krishtanovskaya elaborated, "Yes, Putin has brought Siloviks with him, but that's not enough to understand the situation. Here's also an objective aspect. The whole political class wished them to come. They were called for service. There was a need of a strong arm, capable from the point of view of the elite to establish order in the country." Furthermore, Krishtanovskaya acknowledged that many individuals held positions in organizations affiliated with the KGB or FSB, such as the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Governmental Communications Commission, the Ministry of Foreign Trade, the press agency News, amongst others. While she noted that employment in these entities didn't necessarily entail direct interactions with special services, it raised questions about their connections. After assessing the presence of both official and affiliated Siloviks, she estimated that they could represent up to 77% of those in positions of power. On the 3rd of July 2020, Russian President Vladimir Putin enacted the amendments to the Russian Constitution through an executive order. The next day, these amendments became official. According to Vladimir Pastukov, a noted Russian political scientist and honorary senior research associate at University College London, as well as Alexander Podrabinek, a respected journalist and defender of human rights in Russia, the amendments signify Russia's progression toward a totalitarian state. They argue that the changes represent a gradual, yet decisive and combative takeover of all aspects of civic and private life, accompanied by the effective outlawing of opposition and dissent. Former Securitate General Ion Mihai Pacepa depicted the KGB as a deeply embedded power within the Soviet Union, stating, "In the Soviet Union, The KGB was a state within a state. He pointed out a concerning continuity in contemporary Russia, where those once affiliated with the KGB control the state, including its nuclear arsenal and strategic oil sector, both of which were bolstered under President Vladimir Putin. The successor organization to the KGB, now known as the FSB, maintains extensive surveillance and enforcement powers and has a higher agent-to-citizen ratio than during Soviet times, as noted by Pacepa. Julie Anderson, a political scientist, warns of the FSB's deepening entanglement with organized crime within an increasingly interconnected world, indicating that such alliances could have dire global consequences. Echoing this view, former KGB officer Konstantin Preobrazhensky implies that the FSB's influence pervades all facets of Russian society, including the military and the Russian Orthodox Church, suggesting that under Putin's regime, a new socio-political system has emerged. Lastly, intelligence analyst Mark Gerecht remarks on the uniqueness of Russia's situation, describing it as an unprecedented case in Europe where present and former intelligence officers exert predominant influence, surpassing even the intelligence apparatus of past totalitarian states in terms of being saturated with intelligence personnel. Andrei Ilarionov has expressed his views on Russia's political structure, describing it as a unique form of corporatism unlike any previous system in the nation's history. Ilarionov, who once advised Vladimir Putin, portrays a scenario where an elite group known as the Corporation of Intelligence Service Collaborators has effectively taken control of the state's mechanisms. According to Ilarionov, these individuals are bound by a code of silence reminiscent of an omerta and enjoy certain privileges, including the authorized use of weapons. He goes on to explain that this corporation has strategically commandeered pivotal state institutions, such as the Tax Service, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Parliament, and the state-run media outlets. Ilarionov alleges that through this manipulation, the corporation's members have monopolized vital national resources, covering the realms of security, politics, economics, information, and finance for their own benefit. Furthermore, Ilarionov points out the exclusive nature of this group, likening it to a separate caste. Echoing this sentiment, a former KGB general's comments emphasize the internal culture and the high value placed on lineage within the Siloviki, a term for security service personnel. A good KGB heritage, as mentioned by the general, is greatly valued, with a tendency for marriages within these Siloviki families. This helps to further strengthen the unity and influence of these networks. In 2004, Boris Nemtsov, a Russian politician, and Vladimir Kara-Murza, an activist, characterized Putinism as a political system marked by several authoritarian traits. They described it as having single-party dominance, the imposition of censorship, a legislature that merely serves as a figurehead, the elimination of judicial independence, a strong consolidation of authority and financial control, and the excessive influence of the security services and governmental administration, especially in matters concerning business. Political expert Andrei Piontkovsky has a rather critical view of the current state of Russia's political and economic systems, describing it as the pinnacle of bandit capitalism. He argues that the classic notion of corruption, where business people bribe officials for advantages, doesn't fully capture the situation in Russia. Instead, he describes a scenario where there is no distinction between politicians, business leaders, and bureaucrats. They have, in his opinion, appropriated the nation's assets for themselves and have taken control of its financial main channels. This perspective is echoed by Julie Anderson, a political scientist, who highlights the ambiguous roles of certain individuals in Russia. She mentions the potential for someone to be engaged in intelligence, organized crime, and business simultaneously. This point is underscored by a quote from James Woolsey, a former director of the CIA. Woolsey suggests that a well-dressed English-speaking Russian individual could be a legitimate business person, a spy, an organized crime member, or all three simultaneously, with the institutions in question apparently accepting this overlap. Dmitry Glinsky, another political analyst, introduces the concept known as Russia Incorporated or Russia Limited, which compares the Russian state to a large private enterprise or gang with exceptional power. He compares the state to a stationary bandit that establishes order by replacing the roving bandits that came before. He references an event in April 2006 when the fusion of business and official capacities notably irritated Putin because of what Glinsky refers to as the effective privatization of the customs area, demonstrating a problematic connection between bureaucrats and businessmen. Political scientist Irina Pavlova has suggested that the group within Russian politics known as the Chekists have broader ambitions than mere corporate unity for financial gain. Pavlova articulates that they aspire to elevate Moscow to a symbolic Third Rome and have a philosophy aimed at opposing American influence. Columnist George Will has characterized the core of Vladimir Putin's political strategy as a form of toxic nationalism coupled with a populist disdain for private wealth, which leverages state power against neighboring countries. He distinctly stated, "Putinism is national socialism without the demonic element of its pioneer." Economic advisor Andrei Illarionov introduces the term Nashism to describe the ideology of the Chekists, which embodies a discriminatory approach to human rights. American historian Peter Suchiu voiced one of the early explicit descriptions of Putin as a fascist believer, asserting that Putin's actions, such as lobbying for the Olympics to be held in his own city, are more aligned with fascist than Marxist principles. In 2021, President Vladimir Putin aligned his thinking with that of Lev Gumilyov, expressing a belief in the cyclical rise and fall of societies, and affirmed Russia's potential to reach great heights based on an infinite genetic code. Experts like Thomas Graham challenge the view that Putin is simply a disgruntled ex-KGB officer. Citing speeches by Putin himself, which reject the Soviet heritage and its policies toward Ukraine, Michael Hirsch of Foreign Policy points to Putin's deep-seated Russian nationalism and territorial claims extending back to Kievan Rus as the reasoning for his insistence on Ukraine being within Russia's domain. Historians draw diverse parallels with Putin's Russia. Roger Griffin likens it to World War II Japan in emulating aspects of fascism without completely embodying it. Conversely, Stanley G. Payne sees a closer resemblance to the 19th century philosophy of Tsar Nicholas I, which was underpinned by orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, rather than to totalitarian regimes like those of Hitler or Mussolini. Following the Russo-Georgian War, there has been a noticeable rise in anti-American sentiment within Russia's intellectual and political circles. Boris Kagarlitsky, who heads the Institute of Globalization and Social Movements, commented on this trend by pointing out a certain irony. He said, "Ironically, one of the dominant trends here is that we are anti-American because we want to be exactly like America. We are angry that Americans are allowed to invade minor nations, and we are not." This statement suggests that some of the resentment stems from a desire for Russia to possess the same international prerogatives as America. Dmitry Trenin, who leads the Moscow Carnegie Center, observed that this wave of anti-Americanism is evolving into a cornerstone of what is considered state-endorsed patriotism in Russia. Moreover, it is noted that the Russian powers that be have ceased to even feign alignment with Western principles, and it is now an open declaration that Russian values diverge significantly from those of the West, especially regarding democracy, human rights, national sovereignty, the role of the government, the church, and family dynamics. In conjunction with these developments, Russia, under President Putin's leadership, has been forging connections with countries that hold anti-American stances, particularly non-Western nations like China and Iran. This shift underscores a strategic realignment and an endeavor to ascertain allies that share Russia's outlook or geopolitical goals. Oxford historian Roger Griffin has drawn parallels between Putin's Russia and Japan during World War II, noting that although Putin's regime shares similarities with fascism, it does not fully embody the ideology. American historian Stanley G. Payne offers a different perspective, suggesting that Putin's Russia more closely aligns with the principles of the 19th century Tsar Nicholas I, which centered around orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, rather than the transformative fascist movements led by Hitler and Mussolini. Payne points out that fascism is generally characterized by its revolutionary zeal and mass mobilization to usher in a new societal order, while Putin's governance model resists social change and discourages public political engagement, focusing instead on maintaining control through a pure management approach by those in power. The implied social contract under Putin offers economic progress and personal freedoms in private life as compensation for abstaining from political activity. Additionally, Russian political scientist Andrei Piontkovsky has made comparisons between the ideology he terms Rashism and German Nazism. He suggests that Putin's rhetoric bears similarities to that of Adolf Hitler, implying that there might be ideological parallels between the two leaders' approaches. Putinism embodies a particular form of Russian nationalism that leans towards a civic understanding of Russia's national identity, as opposed to one rooted purely in ethnicity. This standpoint has faced opposition from ethnic nationalists who criticize President Vladimir Putin's immigration policies. They argue that these policies allow a significant influx of people from post-Soviet regions, such as Central Asia and the Caucasus, into what is traditionally considered the Slavic core of Russia. However, Putin has been publicly dismissive of the ethno-nationalist slogan, "Russia for Russians." In a 2003 television appearance, he labeled those who support such sentiments as either idiots or provocateurs, and underlined his belief in Russia as a nation that is inherently multi-ethnic and multicultural. In response to a rise in racist violence during the 1990s, and as Putin assumed the presidency in the year 2000, anti-extremism laws were introduced. These laws, according to Robert Horvath of La Trobe University, were leveraged not only against racist threats, but also used to suppress pro-democracy and leftist activists. While the Kremlin initially utilized nationalist militants to undermine opposition figures, it eventually incarcerated the violent extremists and allowed pro-Putin nationalism to thrive. On December 25, 2022, Putin made an unambiguous statement in a television interview, revealing a territorial ambition for Russia to unite the Russian people, referring specifically to the ethnic Russian group. This marks a clear expression of an ethno-nationalist goal, which represents a shift in Putin's public nationalist rhetoric. Several right-wing European political influencers and organizations have displayed connections to Vladimir Putin, including the French politician Marine Le Pen, Italy's Matteo Salvini, and segments of Germany's Alternative for Germany party. These affiliations reach across the Atlantic, with endorsements from certain American right-wing protagonists as well. However, the Russian incursion into Ukraine incited a shift, causing a few populists to re-evaluate and pull back their support for Putin. Richard Shorten, from the University of Birmingham, highlighted how Putin's allure transcends extreme factions like the Manosphere white supremacists, and also resonates with broader segments of Western conservatives who favor his stark, unyielding stance on social conservatism. Meanwhile, Jason Stanley from Yale University presented Putin as the face of Russian Christian nationalism, adopting and nurturing the image of a global trailblazer for Christian nationalist ideology, gaining recognition from like-minded supporters internationally. Several experts have made the case that Vladimir Putin may harbor intentions to re-establish the grandeur of the Russian Empire. James Krapfel from McGill University has noted significant similarities between Putin's actions and the approach of the historic Russian leader Catherine the Great, acknowledging remarkable parallels with Putin's strategy. On a notable occasion, the 350th anniversary of Peter the Great's birth on June 9, 2022, Putin himself drew a direct link between his ambitions and the past, referring to territories won by Peter in the Great Northern War as rightfully reclaimed by Russia. He further likened Russia's current challenges to those faced during Peter's era. The ideology of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, once central to the Russian Empire, has been associated with Putin's governance by various analysts. Faith Hillis from the University of Chicago has posited that Putin is endeavoring to re-establish the empire's foundational ideologies, combined with the operation of a highly effective police state. Furthermore, a 2014 analysis published in the Journal of Eurasian Studies draws parallels between Putin and Emperor Nicholas I, who originally promulgated the empire's doctrine. It argues that Putin, much like Nicholas, champions nationalism, a powerful state and centralized authority as justifications for his centralized and autocratic governance approach, suggesting a strong ideological alignment with the former emperor. Richard Shorten from the University of Birmingham has observed that the element from the Soviet era that persists in Putin's approach is a profound preoccupation with security, which characterized the later stages of that period, rather than any ideals about a perfect society. In alignment with this perspective, Tom Parfit, reporting for The Guardian, references Richard Sakwa's viewpoint that Putin's loyalty to the Soviet Union is less about advocating for communist ideologies and is instead focused on the goal of overcoming the adversaries that surround Russia. Vladimir Putin has often spoken about the end of the Soviet Union in 1991 with distinct bitterness, attributing its collapse in part to the formation of autonomous republics for ethnic minorities within its structure and to Mikhail Gorbachev's late 1980s reforms. He strikingly characterized the event as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, in a statement made in 2005. More recently, in a 2021 documentary, he labeled the fall as a fragmentation of what he termed historical Russia, which was known as the Soviet Union. During his 2022 speech on the crisis in Ukraine, he described the split as the disintegration of the historical Russia, and has been quoted saying, "Anyone who doesn't regret the passing of the Soviet Union has no heart. Anyone who wants it restored has no brains." Putin has also pointed fingers at the Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin, suggesting his preferential policies towards national minorities within the Soviet umbrella weakened Russia's stability. In his 2022 address on Ukraine, Putin went to the extent of claiming that modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, or, to be more precise, by Bolshevik, communist Russia. These assertions have led some observers to speculate on Putin's nostalgia for the Soviet Union, with some suggesting he may be seeking its restoration. US President Joe Biden commented, after Russia initiated its offensive in Ukraine, that Putin intends to re-establish the former Soviet Union. However, this position has been met with differing interpretations. Mario Kessler from the Center for Contemporary History interprets Putin's actions as a revival of the imperial desires of Tsarist Russia, contrasting it with Lenin's internationalism that is in stark contrast to Putin's great Russian chauvinism. Cihan Tugal from the University of California, Berkeley, offers a perspective that Putin sees the history of the region through a lens where Ukraine and the other nations of the USSR are communist artifacts and only Russia is real and natural. Additionally, Naomi Klein suggests that one of Putin's motivations is a desire to overcome the shame of punishing economic shock therapy imposed on Russia at the end of the Cold War.